On the other hand, the people that they encountered in Greece that they easily overcame and destroyed, not so much, right? They called them Greculi, little Greeks, which is an incredibly disparaging term. But these little Greeks, after they were defeated militarily and destroyed politically, the Romans enslaved them and brought the educated ones back to Italy to be the tutors to their children. This is the point at which educated Romans start learning Greek and can now read and think about the Greek tradition. So that's a big deal. What else?
Professor, I had a question. I really was moved by, in your lecture, you talked about books, felonizing the dismantling of books, like that. We shouldn't be allowed to do that. I mean, we're here, you're the professor, but I find myself always wanting to know a little bit something more about you as the man. So I think I got a little insight into you. But okay, my question was, you seem to intimate that Polybius was writing for the future, writing for a future audience. Like, please learn from me so that you can do better in the future. Is there evidence to suggest like that was his intent, to write for posterity?
Well, every great writer is writing for posterity. I mean, there's no accidentally permanent book, right?
What about Marcus Aurelius?
What?
Marcus Aurelius' Meditations.
Oh, okay. There you go. You got me. You're right.
One book.
Yeah, fair enough. And there probably are others. Perhaps they didn't even get written down. I don't know. Or perhaps they didn't survive. I don't know that either. But accidental greatness is very rare. The only example of it that I can think of in the 20th century would be the movie Casablanca. It's a really great movie if you haven't seen it, but they didn't even know what the ending was going to look like when they started shooting, and they kept redoing it on the fly. And they did a whole bunch of reaction shots with Bogart and Ingrid Bergman when they were told emote, but they weren't told what they were emoting about, whether it was joy or sadness, because they weren't sure, because they hadn't finished the script yet. So they just packed this thing together, and for some reason, accidentally, the movie works beautifully. So yes, there are examples of accidental greatness, but they are rare. Not quite as rare as greatness. It's rarer than greatness itself, which is rare by itself. So I think Polybius is writing for an audience of educated Romans who are very open to having explained to them why they're so great. In other words, it's a very flattering portrait. Here's some Greek that says, I know the whole Greek tradition, and these Romans are something new. These Romans have found a way to create that political stability that Aristotle said we should be shooting for in the politics. And how did they do it? They had a mixed polity, and they found a way to extend citizenship further into the empire than any of the Greek city-states did. So the emergence of the Roman Republic and all of its conquered territories is a way of answering Aristotle's claim that you need a polis in order to have a satisfactory working political system. In fact, you don't, and the Romans are blazing new trails here. Regrettably, we only have a fraction of Polybius's work. One of the sad things is that we lose many more books that are worth reading than we actually hold on to. But what we have is very important, because the idea of cycles happening again and again, I believe that during the Trump administration, some guy came up with a cyclical interpretation of American history, which I thought dreadful. It was really wrong. I mean, for a lot of reasons. I know American history reasonably well, and it doesn't work. But what he's doing is going back to a very archaic way of thinking about history, all right? The Enlightenment was nothing if not linear. That's where we got the idea of progress. And you can't have progress, or you can't have progressive politics without an idea of progress. And you can't have progress in a cyclical view of history, right? You're just going back to the same thing. Progress requires a beginning, a middle, and an end, like Aristotle said about tragedy. Somebody had a hand?
Yeah.
Okay, what?
I'm curious, when I was reading Lucian, I noticed that all of them were atheistic. All of them were basing it on like different kinds of happiness or like how to live in a non-religious lifestyle. But the Romans, they had like a split of different types of religions in the same polity or the same empire. But I'm curious, you've said before that you're like a Christian in your metaphysical beliefs.
No, not
so
so
I'm
much.
curious.
Actually, it's in my practical beliefs. In
Okay.
other words, I don't care whether Jesus resurrects or not. I care about whether people show sufficient regard for one another or not. But please go ahead.
But that's the thing though, like where do you get that sort of where do you get ethics if not from metaphysics? So where do you choose? Because you could say that it's only all about practical stuff, but you have to choose what aim you're going for anyways.
That's right. And that's a great point. My view is that the big problem for our species is to find a way to reconcile two ultimate values, which is a contradiction in terms. Only one of them can be ultimate, but how to reconcile reason and love is, I think, the big unanswered question for our species. If you imagine a Venn diagram, they almost always overlap, but there's always a small failure to overlap. And that disjunction is where things get really hard. Now, where do I get this? That's very difficult. I get it as a cumulative result of doing my best to read the tradition that I was born into and understand what it was in order to understand myself. And then from there, because I was raised as a Christian, I view religions as languages. So that's my first language. On the other hand, I've learned enough Plato and studied it carefully enough so that I have a near native fluency in Platonism. And I have much less fluency in various other traditions, but I've done my best to learn something about them. Now, where does it come from? It comes from what I might call a dynamic equilibrium between what I'll call the intracosm, the universe within me, subjectivity, and the exocosm, the world outside me. And what I'm doing is trying to create a homeostasis, a sort of balanced equilibrium between those two things. And I don't mean this in a literal sense, because clearly I'm not creating a literal equilibrium, but that's the best metaphor I can give you to explain something that I don't have a good explanation for. In other words, when I don't know, I just say so. Right? On the other hand, maybe knowing things isn't everything, and maybe rationality isn't everything. If you have a look at the Kierkegaard lecture, you'll find, strangely, that it's very hard to justify reason on the basis of reason, because you're presupposing what you're trying to prove, which leads Kierkegaard to draw the inference that reason isn't reasonable. Or the way I might be tempted to phrase it is that the high point of reason is to come to the perimeter where you recognize what the limits of reason are. I'm not sure that the Sermon on the Mount or the parable of the Good Samaritan make rational sense. Those of you who know the Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics will perhaps be surprised by the fact that it makes no mention of altruism. The reason why is that Aristotle's trying to be rational, and you don't feel other people's pleasure or pain, so why should you care what happens to them? Unless, of course, you need them in your polis so that you can have a satisfactory life for yourself. So my worry about making an idol out of rationality is that it's purely egoistic. I'm not sure it makes sense what the Good Samaritan decides to do. On the other hand, the inference I draw from that is not that the Good Samaritan is wrong, but rather that maybe making sense isn't everything. Maybe sometimes love trumps reason.
But if you hate people, then why not go for that? Because
Right,
it's all
exactly.
emotion anyways.
That's perfectly reasonable. Exactly my point. But I don't think love and hate are equal. right? I don't have a rational explanation for that. All I can tell you is I have learned from ancient masters, Buddha and Jesus and a bunch of others, the Hebrew prophets, Confucius, men I respect, but who aren't always giving me propositional knowledge that can be tested empirically. There's more to thinking than that. All right. So what I would say is that religions are a kind of language, and I include Platonism as a religion. I think it's what it is a kind of Pelagianism, where you think yourself up to the throne of God, which turns out not to be a person, but the form of the good. But it has all the properties that God used to have, or that God has in the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem, except that it isn't a person. It's this crystal of perfection that just sits there being what it is, right? And I think that ultimately what the Republic wants its readers to do is worship the form of the good. And I think that the gold class is a semi-hereditary priesthood, and I think that the philosopher king or queen is in fact a high priest. That's why when you ask Plato, what is the form of the good? He tells you stuff like, it's like the sun, which is true, but completely uninformative. You can't talk about absolute anything. One of the things that I would recommend you take a look at if you want to be amazed and edified, Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote a lecture on ethics. It's 8 pages long because that was all he could think of to say. And he ends it by saying something like, our attempt to talk about absolute value, the ultimate good, and all the rest of that is absolutely, completely hopeless. And we inevitably run up against the glass prison of language. So this does not add to our knowledge in any sense. And then he says, and this is the killer, but it represents a tendency in the human mind that I cannot help but respect deeply, and I would not for my life ridicule it. So here we have the mystic logician, which is a really weird combination. But I think Wittgenstein gets it right. Being reasonable isn't everything. On the other hand, and this is something I would emphasize, when you try and be more than reasonable, you almost always fail and end up being less than reasonable. So the Athenians have a real good point to make. So when I say that I take religion seriously, what I mean is that it's a kind of language that allows us to talk about things that literal speech won't let us talk about. Unless you're going to make the ultimate good pleasure, in which case you're going to be an egoist again, and that gets rid of the Good Samaritan and altruism altogether. All right. I don't know if that answer made sense. You asked me such a big question, and because my brain doesn't work right anymore, I tend to miss big stuff. So, you can always stop me and push back. It's okay, especially if I start to talk too long.
I just had an anecdote from my life. So I used to have really bad anxiety, and I would kind of overthink everything and kind of be like, oh, I'm thinking about like my stocks and like my spreadsheets and all that stuff. And at one point I started kind of pulling that with my girlfriend. And then she just kind of went, well, I'm not a spreadsheet. This is something that's just, you can't really plan for this. You can't like logic this. This is this. It's like love is kind of its own thing. You have to just ride the wave,
There's a beautiful line in Meister Eckhart. He's my favorite Christian mystic. And he says, love has no why. I'm not 100% sure what that means, although I sense that something deep is going on there. All right.
Is that like the Stoic notion of virtue is enough?
That's right. That's exactly right. That's why Christianity, when it gets married to Stoicism, gives us Immanuel Kant. We got one set of moral rules, applies universally to everybody. And by God, it's rational. Thank God for Newton. Now I can be the Newton of the moral world and give you the final word on this. I mean, he's not modest, but if you have a brain like Immanuel Kant, there's really no justification for being modest. I mean, have you ever looked at a picture of Kant? He looks like one of those things from Star Trek that controls the ship with its mind, right? So appearances can be deceiving, but they aren't always.
So I had a question about your. This is something I'd been thinking about this since you mentioned it in the first lecture, about the religions as languages. There were a couple things I had thought of. The first one was how does the incarnation, for Christianity particularly, how does the incarnation fit in with that calculus? Because one of the things that I find doesn't quite link up is when Christianity is talked about as being on the same level as Platonism, because I don't think that's quite true. I think there are certain Christians for sure who definitely treat it that way. But when you actually analyze the text and look at what these early Jewish writers, the first Christians, were writing, they're interpreting a lot of this stuff literally, and interpreting Jesus' sacrifice through the lens of Second Temple Judaism sacrifice.
Right. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
When people ask me, do I literally believe the stories in Scripture? I ask, well, before I answer, could you tell me what hangs on that? In other words, what's going to change on the basis of whether I say yes or no?
I think the incarnation of Jesus is one of the things that hangs on that, in that, especially if you consider the sacrificial element, the work of Jesus' sacrifice, like that's something that once you abstract that, the texts don't, at least it seems to me, don't work.
I can take that argument very seriously. I found a way to make them work within the context of my understanding by shrugging my shoulders and say, look, I wasn't there. I don't know if men rise from the dead or if they walk on water. And for me, the magic show doesn't make any difference. The reason why is that I think that I'm being told something true here, regardless of whether the stories about the teller are true or not. Or in other words, my point is, I don't think anything hangs on it.
So by true, do you mean historically accurate? Because I wouldn't agree with that either.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what I do is I say, look, I'm a Humean skeptic. In other words, I'm more skeptical than most. And instead of saying that didn't happen, because after all, I wasn't there, how am I supposed to know? All I can say is it doesn't seem to me very probable. On the other hand, whether it's probable or not doesn't seem to undermine the teachings, which are something new and completely alien to the Greco-Roman tradition. So I think that the best thing that happened to the West is that they managed to connect a system of symbols and a system of images, saying things that literal language cannot, or at least cannot adequately say. And what that does is rescue us from ourselves. If all we had was the Athenian or Greco-Roman tradition, the ideal human being would be Dr. Spock from Star Trek. And most of us see that there's something mechanical and lacking there. And what is lacking is the things that make us human, the things that make us more than recording machines of the empirical world, and which make us able to see the value of love and deny the purely empirical and accurately empirical claim that feelings are feelings and love and hate are really indistinguishable on the basis of mere observation. One way of teaching it when I did it when I taught my children was to tell them that, because 5-year-olds can understand the parable of the Good Samaritan. One of the things that I would ask them is, do you understand what it is that you're being taught here? And what do you think about being nice to people that are hurting? You think that's a good idea? I think you're right. So I think that it makes accessible very complicated thoughts, and not maybe logically linear connected thoughts, discontinuous thoughts. But there may be some value to that. As I said when I talked about Meister Eckhart, what if there's a category of statement that is literally meaningful nonsense? If you want an example, let me give you one. every metaphor is meaningful nonsense. Let me give you an idea. You know what the Turing test is? That's how you can find out if a machine is sentient, by asking it questions, and if having a back and forth with it doesn't enable you to decide, well then whether it's a human being back there typing that out or whether it's an AI machine typing that, creating those sentences, what you have is a conscious AI. Okay, the way I would get around this, and this I suppose is the programmer's nightmare, I would say to the Turing machine, do you like Shakespeare? And hopefully, whether it's a person or a machine, they've taught it to like Shakespeare. Okay. And then I would say, do you know Romeo and Juliet? And hopefully they do. And I'd say, do you know the line where Romeo says, Juliet is the sun? And I'd say, yeah, because that's actually in the text. And I say, okay, how far away is Romeo from Juliet? 93 million miles? Well, literally, that's what that means. On the other hand, as a metaphor, what you're always doing is taking something and identifying it, making it equal to something else that it isn't. My love is a red, red rose. No, it's not. On the other hand, metaphors are all literally nonsensical. If you make them rational and logically coherent by adding like or as, you don't have a metaphor anymore. Then you have a simile. Do you want to toss out all metaphors because none of them make any sense? Metaphors are what I would call meaningful nonsense. Now that's messed up. Imagine trying to program a computer to identify meaningful nonsense. It's one thing to say that Juliet is the sun. It's another thing to say my thumb is a can of beer. That has the same structure as a metaphor logically, but that's real gibberish as opposed to meaningful gibberish. And what rule would you invoke? Would you teach a computer to be able to figure out which is which? Can you imagine what programming that would be like? When two different things are called identical, and some of them are meaningful, and some of them, and the vast majority of them are meaningless. How is it possible for there to be meaningful nonsense? I think every religion cashes in on that.
I'm curious if in the course of, and this is something I've only just learned about this, so I really don't have a whole lot of, I couldn't explain it if you haven't come across this. So if you haven't, then we can just move on. Post-liberalism in terms of biblical scholarship advanced by guys like Stanley Hauerwas, which take more of a Wittgensteinian view. They take this sort of language idea, but they sort of do the opposite of what you're doing and say, well, my understanding, the specifics of the language in which you are, I guess, experiencing the religion actually change your experience. I'm wondering if that's something that you've come across.
Yeah, I mean, I have great admiration for his work, although I can't say that I agree with most of what I've read by him. Right? I think that the attempt to hold on to a literal conception of religious texts is probably not going to work, right? Because we have good Humean reasons to bracket these things and put question marks behind them saying, why should we believe this? And yes, I understand that, who is it that I'm thinking of? Damn, it'll come to me. I understand that fideism is viewed as being a necessary part, an aspect of Christianity and perhaps other religious traditions as well. I don't want to go there because it leaves too many things to chance, right? The accident of where you were born determines your language and determines your culture. On the other hand, when I see something like Pentecost in the New Testament, what that looks like to me is the inverse of that. It looks to me like now what we're gesturing at is people that can speak every language and be understood in every language, because what this is gesturing at is the idea that there's a moral substrate that supports and sustains every specific culture, and it's the same in every culture. So what the Pentecost did, where they had tongues of fire that gave everybody universal linguistic access, that's the inversion of the old story of the Tower of Babel. All right. I'm a Pentecost version of Christianity rather than a Tower of Babel version. Yes, maybe we can find some rough Wittgensteinian workaround so we can connect them, but I actually believe that there is a moral reality. I think there are moral facts, and we dispute them sometimes, but we also dispute all kinds of facts. And sometimes we can come to an agreement, and sometimes we can't. Not every claim is a matter of propositional logic. One of my favorites, if you get a chance, and it's actually my favorite book of the Bible, which shows how weak a Christian I am. It's the book of Proverbs. There's a great, I think it's in chapter 8. It says, "Reprove the fool, lest he think himself wise." And the next line is, "Do not reprove the fool, lest you become like him." Now, the fact that these are directly contradictory did not escape the people who constructed this. What they're pointing out is that this contradiction doesn't have a false element in it. It doesn't work like the logic of mathematics. Both of these things are true. What you need is the Aristotelian phronesis to know when to invoke which rule, right? Because it's true. Arguing with a fool, particularly on the internet, is a losing proposition, right? Not arguing with a fool is an abdication of responsibility. He may have hurt himself or somebody else. And so what that's gesturing at is that there's no good way to deal with fools. And that's actually true, right? And so both of those terms that are directly contradictory, which is why they're put together, is meant to show that we're using a different kind of logic here. The rules for understanding this are different. And if it were a math class, you'd mark it wrong. But the fact of the matter is, those of you who ever argued with a fool or heard a fool and decided not to bother to argue with him know that both of those things are true. Damn. All right. So perhaps human nature and the best kind of thinking is more extensive and more complicated than we suspect. What else?
Could you say a little bit about how Polybius compares to Livy and how their perspectives were different based on them writing in different periods?
Well, right. Livy is writing about the early history of Rome, and he's trying to give Rome a mythic origin. So he wants to connect it back to Romulus and Remus and its early, misty, uncertain times. That's not the way Polybius operates. He's more under the influence of Thucydides, so he's more interested in sticking to empirical reality. And the empirical reality is enough so that he doesn't need to make his peace with myth. Right now, granted, we have limits of a limited amount of Livy, and we have a limited amount of Polybius. So these all have to be tentative generalizations. But much of Roman history is an attempt to incorporate, I think nowadays it's called cultural appropriation, to take the Greek tradition and say, this is really our tradition. And that helps mitigate the fact that so much of Roman culture is derivative, right? The Greeks have a set of epics. One is about a battle to destroy a city, and the other is about a sea journey where a guy goes home. Aeneas, or rather Virgil, says, I'm going to co-opt this. I'm going to pick this idea up, but I'm going to put a new spin on it. I'm going to have the sea journey come first. Right? And then, instead of having a battle to destroy a city, we're going to have a battle to create one. Now, this is obviously lifted and stolen. If you did a thing like that as an undergraduate, you would be called aboard before the honor board because it's clearly plagiarism. And the modifications that he makes are very limited. The one modification that I think is most important in Virgil is that he introduces a a new virtue in the Roman catalog of virtues that the Greeks didn't spend much time on, and that was pietas, or accepting your obligations to the gods, which is the same thing as destiny, which is what Aeneas does all through it. Remember when he has that love affair with Dido, and Dido is completely taken with him, but he gets reminded by Hermes that, look, big boy, you're not supposed to be enjoying yourself here in Carthage. You're supposed to get to the Italian peninsula and found Rome. And so he takes off in the middle of the night, says, bye, babe, I gotta go. And she responds by setting herself on fire. Right? She does not have pietas. She is burning up with emotion. Aeneas does have pietas because he recognizes an obligation that he doesn't ask for, but he is required to accept. All right. So he's becoming, like Pindar said, he's becoming who he is.
So I had a question about the Lucian text.
Okay, good.
Because I was, one of the things that was kind of sticking to me about it was that he had Zeus and Hermes as sort of the gods that were doing it, but he was talking about Rome. And I read out Lucian was, I guess, Syrian or Turkish, something like that.
Yeah.
So I was trying to figure out, is he basically calling Rome out on its cultural appropriation of Greece, because he's using Zeus and Hermes, but he's also using like the forum of a Roman slave auction to say something of how Rome kind of interchanges those ideas and doesn't really take philosophy seriously, whereas the Greeks did.
Well, yeah, the Greeks did take philosophy seriously, and that's why they destroyed themselves. The dumb guys, the Spartans, won the Peloponnesian War. The smart guys outsmarted themselves. So, yeah, the Romans have made it a policy not to get that smart, to the point where you destroy the society. I'm not sure that he's so much criticizing Rome as he is criticizing philosophical dogmatism and the arrogance, the hubris of philosophers. When you have an infinite plurality of possible ideas, in some ways it's like us facing the internet. How you choose between them, how you evaluate and prioritize them is anybody's guess. In other words, there's such a thing as having too many options to make a good choice. And what he's, I think, pointing out is that we Romans have inherited Greece, and that's amazing enough. But we've also inherited a whole bunch of stuff from the Near East and from Egypt and from North Africa. And there are too many possibilities for anybody to know how to handle the various alternatives. And anyone who says that he knows the right alternative, because of the brevity of human life, must of necessity arbitrarily chosen one and now sticks to that. So there was a tradition of skepticism in Greece. But it is not a dominant school, because skepticism is inevitably merely a partial philosophy. A skeptic is someone who calls you long distance and then reverses the charges and asks you to pay for it. So you take the burden of proof. I'll do all the question asking, but I'm not going to answer any questions unless to greet you with more questions. Right? So it's like somebody that says he wants to play chess with you, but only will take the white pieces. No burden of proof for a skeptic. Right? Or like a tennis player that says, I'm only willing to play provided I serve every game. Well, okay, I understand, Mr. Skeptic, what you don't believe in. Could you explain to me what you do believe in? And what you do take as true and as sufficiently understandable for the basis of life and action. And here's where skeptics start to do the kind of crab walk. They don't want to come forward because they know they're going to get unpleasant questions, but they don't want to retreat because they like the ground they've gained. So now they're going to start going back and forth, and you're going to get a little bit of the old soft shoe. But skeptics, if they're going to be real intellectuals, have to be willing to take up the burden of proof and affirm something, as well as asking questions about anything. A good example would be Socrates. There's an element of skepticism in Socrates. He says, what do I know? I don't know anything. That's what makes me the smartest guy. But you folks have read the Gorgias, and you know that at the end of the Gorgias, he stops engaging in the dialectic and stops pretending that he doesn't know anything and begins to harangue Callicles and all the audience, telling them what they need to do and what they should think. So he's only a limited skeptic. And I think for Socrates, skepticism is a pose he takes rather than a sufficient philosophy by itself. So I don't think that Lucian is attacking Rome or criticizing Rome. It wouldn't have become nearly so popular then. But, and this is something else you might want to think about, I believe that comedy is cognitive. In other words, I think that you can learn stuff from comedy, and it is at least as important in terms of cognition as tragedy is. Mostly philosophers like to talk about tragedy and how deep it is and how you find out about the hopelessness, the wilderness of the human condition. Well, I think that comedy is cognitive too. Not all of it, but some of it. This is an example of cognitive comedy. He says, look at the arrogance of these philosophers. None of them agree with each other, and all of them say that they've gotten direct access to ultimate reality. I'm the only guy who tells the truth, says Lucian. I don't know what ultimate reality is, and neither do any of them.
So do you have any sense why he used Zeus and Hermes as opposed to Jupiter and Mercury?
No, I don't. Well, probably because he was raised Greek speaking.
Okay.
And that's his first language religiously. All right. Now, again, if you want to see how derivative Roman culture is, the Greeks have 6 gods, 6 goddesses on a mountaintop. The Romans have that too, but the names are changed. Yeah, all right. They're not remarkable for their innovation. All right. They just slap a Roman name on them and they go to work. All right. He still has the old Greek names, but I don't think he wishes to pick a quarrel with Roman culture. Now, one thing it's worth thinking about, if you look at the history of the world, if you look at the history of Chinese culture or the history of Indian culture, I have a partial history of the world written, and you can find some of that stuff on my Substack spot. But what I found is this, and this might be worth thinking about. Large empires that have, or large cultural groupings that have immense territory and immense numbers of people, they go in 2 directions. If they have a real strong centralized authority, then they don't need religion to the same degree, or they don't need religious integration to the same degree that decentralized, broken up political entities do. So for a big, powerfully centralized government like China, they can have Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism and whatever else you want to believe in, provided you pay your taxes. They're relaxed with that. The same, there are other examples of that, but let me go to a different sort of example. Decentralized cultural groups like Western Europe or the Islamic Ummah or subcontinental India. They're broken up into a large number of relatively small, separate political units. There, it's much more dangerous to allow a plurality of religions to develop. They need to, what integrates the culture is not the political regime, it's the religion. So I think that's a big part of the reason why Buddhism begins in India, gets chased out. It's too dangerous to have multiple political traditions unless you can find a way to syncretize them. On the other hand, when the Buddhists go to China, the Chinese are all right with this. I mean, it sounds like really interesting stuff and seems to help us find a way for religious illumination. And it's not a threat to the government. So they say, look, as long as Buddhists pay their taxes, they can believe whatever they want. Same sort of thing with Western Europe. The reason why it had to be universally Christian, and for the earliest part of it, universally Catholic, is because it's all broken up into smaller political units called nation states. Think about the size of the Islamic world, stretching from Morocco to Indonesia. All right. If you don't have social integration and moral integration created by religion, you're not going to be able to do it, to rule it from one's political center. So strong political centralism means that you can be relaxed about religion. And you can have a plurality of religions, provided they don't cause civil uproar. If you have broken up groupings, smaller groupings of political power, then there's a greater need to integrate these societies. And what performs that function is not the government, it's the religion. Right? Look at the decentralized, broken up societies. They tend to have only one religion and be rather intolerant of alternatives. This is not simple human meanness. There's a reason for this. The reason is it's dangerous to the integration and coherence of society. If you have an all-powerful God emperor like you do in China, it's not that big a deal. He will cut your head. The emperor will cut your head off no matter what your religion is, if you cause political problems. But it's not a danger to the Chinese regime in the way it would be a danger to decentralized, broken up regimes like the principalities that we see in India or the nation states that we see in Western Europe. Right? So religious unity is not merely people being mean to each other. It actually serves a function. And that's why we see it so often, and particularly we see it in decentralized political groups. Centralized political groups are very different.
Did Lucian have any particular philosophy, or he was just sort of a comic? Did Lucian have any particular affirmative philosophy that he was, or he's just kind of a comic anarchist?
Well, the best I've been able to see is that they aren't willing to theoretically affirm things, because that means you're not a skeptic anymore. You could define a skeptic as somebody that asks questions but doesn't make declarative sentences. In practice, what it means is that he likes the here and now, and like Hume, he likes ale and mutton, right? Practical things. Right? Any platonic stuff that allows us to float off the ground like a soap bubble, they don't want to hear that stuff. So they like simple, direct, basic pleasures. And that will go back to somebody like Diogenes the Cynic. Right? At least these pleasures are real, and at least these values that I hold are real. He said, I'll take a hamburger over the Holy Spirit any day, because hamburgers are real. Right? And my skepticism ends when my belly starts demanding food. Then I know how to solve the problem. So what does Lucian believe? Damned if I know. From what I can tell, most of them would prefer to pretend that they don't believe anything. More than likely, they're kind of fairly primitive hedonists. And I don't mean to say that about Hume. He's a very sophisticated hedonist, and I really like him. Right now, he's a big, fat, jolly old Scotsman, playing the world's largest practical joke on the Enlightenment, laughing up his sleeve. He said, oh, by the way, I'm sorry, but I've destroyed philosophy. That's the bad news. The good news is that it doesn't make any difference. Carry on, do whatever you were doing, because philosophy doesn't amount to anything. You got to like Hume. I don't see how anybody can not like him. You don't have to believe him, but he's a philosopher that I'd like to have a beer with. Right? There are plenty that I don't want to talk to. I mean, that I may admire, but I don't like these people. Right? And Hume is a jolly fellow. He's got to be in the first circle of Dante's hell. And he makes me wonder, do I really want to go to heaven? Which, don't tell my Christian friends that. They get all excited. But, I got to say, if I get a good seat in hell in the first circle, I really have nothing to complain about. All right? I mean, no, I'm too old to start arguing with God. That's a young man's idea. Right. I've been through enough so that I just say, all right, well, whatever you want is cool, because I'm not going to argue with omnipotence or omniscience. I'd rather not. So people, I mean, look, I have advanced metastatic cancer, and and as Wittgenstein said, one way in which he describes what it means to believe in God is the feeling of being perfectly safe. I got 7 metastatic tumors on my spine, and I'm chill about it. They've been there 11 years, and I just don't get excited about it. I don't shake my fist at God. I don't shake my fist at nature or whatever it is that's in charge of stuff. I have nothing but gratitude because I'm not entitled to exist. Right? And it's when you get rid of the fact that you're entitled to exist. We are lucky and fortunate to be among those small number of atoms that have been put together in such a way that we started thinking about ourselves and everything else. Now, you're lucky to get 70 years out of that because you don't deserve anything. You deserve to be a scattered bunch of atoms. All right? And so be grateful for the time you got rather than angry about the fact that you're not immortal. That's kid stuff.
It's very stoic.
Well, I admire the guy. I admire them all. They're better men than I am.
Can I ask you a real quick sort of question?
Yep.
So when you were talking about how was it Lucian or Polybius that you said thinks cyclically?
That's Polybius.
Okay, Polybius. So I understand that concept that everything happens in a cycle, but sure, there's a book that I meaning to get to read, but I haven't got it yet. But I sort of wonder if I'm gonna see some of the theme of cyclical time in that book, and it's called Difference and Repetition by Deleuze.
By who?
Deleuze.
Yeah, I've heard the title. I don't know the book. So the idea of going back to archaic cyclical notions is actually not unusual, right? When people lose faith in the idea of progress, the only other alternative is circles. We're repeating the same thing again and again. Or if you're a clever poet like Yeats, he says, I want the circle and the line together. So I think that history is a spiral. All right, maybe it is. See, poets are always smarter than philosophers, and they know what's going on and the artists know what's going on long before the intellectuals do. If you don't like the poetry of Yeats, keep reading it until you do. You're supposed to.
Okay.
It's good for you. So what was it? Repetition and what? Cycles and repetition. This could be an attempt to go back to an earlier, what I would describe as archaic conception of time. If you want to get the best introduction to this, one of my old teachers from college, Mircea Eliade's Cosmos and History. If you don't know that book, that's a book you want. Okay.
Say it again.
Cosmos and History by a guy named Eliade. And here's the good thing. It's like 120 pages.
Oh, wow. That's pretty short.
Yeah, but it's not a quick read.
Oh, I know books like that. There's another book I read it's a little book, like 98 pages, but it is dense.
Think of the Tractatus that Wittgenstein wrote. Whoa.
Oh, yeah.
That's neutron prose, right? I mean, it's the densest possible prose.
My dad has it on his shelf. I opened it and I just put it right back on the shelf.
This is too smart for me. I know that feeling. I've had many circumstances in which I was tempted to throw a book across the room, not due to any defect in the book, but into a defect in my patience and my brains. Fortunately now, I'm having a hard enough time holding on to the books I've read, so I've greatly diminished the number of new books I read because I'm having a hard time keeping the fences mended in the territory that I own.
I was wondering if I could ask a question on, since we're on cyclical history.
Yeah.
One thing we started exploring with Dr. Staloff that we didn't quite get to develop fully due to time. I was curious. This is one of the ideas that you had mentioned last week, and I don't know if you mentioned it before I joined, and that Dr. Staloff mentioned was the influence of the Judeo-Christian tradition on changing views of time from cyclical to linear. Mm-hmm. I was curious. I don't really have I've not done obviously the research or the reading, but part of me is almost skeptical that the change from linear time was completely just due to Judeo-Christianity and more so due to the Enlightenment conception of Judeo-Christianity. Because when you go back and read the texts, mm-hmm. you've got places like in Ecclesiastes, where there's nothing new under the sun. And you do obviously still have with early Christians, the eschaton, and a general linear time. But to me, in my reading of that always seemed to me to be, and maybe I'm wrong about this, again, I'm not done the reading, but that seemed to be the way they were thinking about that, is that's God's perspective. And here on earth, broken, we're stuck in this cyclical loop.
Well,
we're not going to break out of that until the eschaton.
Okay, you know the Bible clearly, so let's talk about that. Unlike most holy books, the big message of the Old Testament is not found at the beginning of the book. We get that actually in Exodus, because it's about God giving people the law. Okay, the first book, Genesis, explains how the world was created, and that has many connections to the Mesopotamian mythic tradition, right? The flood and all that jazz. But the key thing there is that in Genesis, you get an understanding of what human nature is, and you'll find that every one of the 10 commandments gets broken in Genesis. This is there to explain to you why you need the law. So we have a beginning, and it's like Aristotle's Poetics, where he talks about tragedy. We have a beginning, we have a middle. The middle will be defined differently by different sects. It can be Moses getting the law, it can be Jesus sacrificing himself on the cross, or it could be the final installment that you get with Muhammad in the cave. But the idea is that there's some turning of the corner. And for each of these traditions, they're moving towards some final reconciliation, some convergence of God and man. And look, this is pretty hard to talk about, because what does it mean for God and man to converge? I mean, you get man-God in the form of Jesus, but once he's gone, when I get to the book of Revelation, I don't know what to make of it, except that the end is coming, and it may not be immediate as the early Christians thought, but there is an end. Now, what happens in 19th century Germany is that this linear conception of history was pseudo-secularized to create the great modern cults, which is political progressivism. And this was done by Hegel and Marx. Hegel described himself, and I think seriously, as an Orthodox Lutheran. I doubt that there were any other Orthodox Lutherans who would regard him as that. And Marx, like it or not, could not shrug off his Jewish tradition. If you look at something like the prophet Amos, who's always going on about how rich people are oppressing poor people, and this has got to stop. And when the Messiah comes back, we're not taking any more of this. You can sand this down and take off the ancient Semitic tradition, but the body of it is still there. In other words, it's the same linear view of history, painted a different color. And one of my favorite teachers in graduate school said that Marxism is the last great Christian heresy. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. So that's why I think that progressive politics and progressive people that participate in this have been let down by their education, because they don't know how deeply indebted to Christianity they are. They say, no, this is really rational. This is where history is going. And I say, look, it would take me a year to explain to you why you don't understand your own ideas. But that's because I don't blame these undergraduates. I blame their teachers, because the teachers have decided to dispense with things that would allow people, that would allow these people like, what am I thinking of? Who am I thinking of? The son of Odysseus, Telemachus. That would allow people to be like Telemachus and find out who they are. I think that something like Amnesty International is a very kind-hearted Christian heresy, right? They want people treated kindly, and they want oppression to be relieved. But if you ask them why, well, it's a flip of the coin, or it's supposed to be self-evident, which it's not, or it's for no good reason. And me, if I don't have a good reason or good logical, coherent reason, I'm willing to resort to myths, because it gives me a language with which to talk about this stuff. So I think that all of left-wing politics is Christianity, and I think Nietzsche was right about that. Again, I learned a great deal from Nietzsche, and when he says that all egalitarianism is Christianity in disguise, I think that's a great idea, except I'm not sure that Nietzsche gets taught any more than the Bible gets taught, or at least taught well, right? So again, here's my Swiss cheese brain. I don't even remember what the question was, but
so it was if we're going back to cyclical versus linear time, sorry, I'm trying to think of how to phrase it in light of what was just said. There are elements of both in Scripture.
Yeah. Okay.
And so my question would be more is kind of more from perhaps a historical standpoint of, well, it seems to me like if you go into the text, you see both. And
right.
Whenever there is linear time changes, that's always God doing that. That's never human beings doing that. Whenever you leave the humans to their own devices, you end up with Judges, where right. The Israelites try to go without God and they end up in exile. And this just happens over and over and over in that book. And
that's the cycle.
Yeah. And you've got Ecclesiastes and whatnot.
Right.
So it seems to me like those early thinkers would have probably taken this into account, and were probably not. Like I'm wondering when exactly the linear time frame.
I see your point.
I know. It seems to me like a plausible explanation would be the Enlightenment, because that's where you start taking things that you would attribute to God and attributing them actually to man. Reason.
Much earlier. How about this?
Okay.
God reveals himself in the Old Testament step by step. He never lies to the people he reveals himself to, but he always withholds something, right? In other words, we get a gradually increasing revelation of God to his people. When they sin, God punishes them, they repent, and then they get a new chapter to Revelation. So when you look at something like the book of Joshua, I mean, this is a genocidal God, a volcano God that says, wipe out everybody in Jericho and wipe out the Moabites and the Ammonites and the whole collection of people that you're going to find in the Promised Land. This is yours. Now, what I think happened, and this is something that I only came on relatively recently while I was thinking about this. The last two tribes of Israel get conquered by the Babylonians. I think it's 586, but I'd have to look at it. My brain is Swiss cheese. But they get taken to Mesopotamia. They are enslaved, the same condition that they were traditionally in Egypt. But then they repent, and this is the time when things like Isaiah get written, Ezekiel gets written, Jeremiah gets written, and the prophets, those major prophets, have a very different outlook from the very insular, inward-looking outlook that we saw in the first part of the Old Testament. Why? Because we've gone through a couple of sin cycles, and God is revealing more of himself. Now, God reveals himself in a way, and it took me a while to connect the dots here, but the Babylonian captivity ends when the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians. And what must have been completely mind-blowing for the Hebrews who were in bondage in Mesopotamia, that after repenting and listening to Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel, the Persians come in and they say, we're going to free you in bunches. And by the way, we're Zoroastrian monotheists. Now, the Jews would have thought that they were the only monotheistic people in the world. Now they're confronted by this gigantic polyglot empire that's monotheistic. Boy, this means things have to change, because here we have the hand of God being manifested in the world in human form, which is why they call, I think it's Darius, a liberator and a savior, right? Now they have a problem with two monotheisms, or is it just one monotheism? And this is what's going to cause first of all, the Jewish scripture to get written down when we get to the Second Temple. And they're also going to have to deal with the fact that they're not the only monotheists in the world. I'll get you in a second. And my best understanding here is that the result was, if you look at something like Isaiah, there's a passage, and again, I can no longer quote it directly, but what he says is, the Jews are my people, and the Assyrians are the work of my hand, and I really love the Egyptians too. That inward-looking tribal volcano god is now universal like Kant, right? And what that is a product of God's progressive revelation of himself. So yes, it's true. You can find it. Scripture is in a way like the history of China. It's so big and lasts so long that you can find in it anything you want to look for. And you can also find the opposite of that. So yes, Ecclesiastes is a really ancient text, right? They attribute it to Solomon, but like Proverbs, this is largely drawn from Egyptian and Mesopotamian sources. So that's an archaic stratum that we have in the Bible. But a much more modern stratum, this is the Second Temple stratum, is when the Israelites have figured out that they're not the only monotheists. And that means that they have to expand their moral horizons. And this is where you're getting the moral universalism, right? And you look up Isaiah. Second Isaiah is the best place to go hunting around for that. But he sounds like Immanuel Kant, and Joshua sounds nothing like that, right? So my argument would be that the earliest strata still have an element of that cyclical history. As Koheleth says, man dies like a dog in the sun. Well, here we're going to have an extra act added in, an afterlife, because they don't have that yet either. But they will get to that, certainly by the time we get, it's mentioned in Isaiah, it's also mentioned in Daniel, right? That's one of the additions that God gives his people in his progressive revelation, okay? So I think that by the time we get to the Second Temple, we have a straight ahead linear view, which has superseded the cyclical view. And it's not what, and it's what we would expect given the time in which these were created. Now, if somebody wanted to ask me a question, go ahead. And yours is the last question.
I had a question about this notion of linear time, and I wanted to ask, like, if also science plays a big role in this, due to the fact that when I encounter with people and talking about linear time, most of the examples are material stuff and material things. So I believe like most of the people encounter, like, they think about the linear time in terms of progress in their lives. I mean, what kind of material thing we have in our position. So maybe that's also plays a big role. And when I talked with a friend of mine that he's a historian, he told me like there was a big necessity for linear time because these two cannot coincide, like cyclical time and also science together, because they're completely two different elements.
Well,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. If you are looking for the origins of the universe and you want a scientific, physical account of it rather than a mythic account, you're presupposing that the universe has an origin. I guess it's the Big Bang, right? So you've already bought into the idea it has a beginning, and we are somewhere in the middle because it hasn't ended yet. But the fact that it has a beginning means that it has to have an end. And so that's going to make it linear. If, on the other hand, you go back to the truly archaic cyclical traditions, there's an idea that time is eternal and that the universe is eternal and didn't have a beginning. So you're only going to be able to get a beginning to the universe if you've already assumed that time has a structure, which has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? It works for a lot of important reasons. Some of it has to do with material development. We have better medicine now than we used to in the past. And I think there's a good argument to say that medicine has progressed. But it's not just a question of an increasing abundance of consumer goods, because some of them are serious, like medicine, but some of them are trivial, right? And not worth calling a real advance. We're going to need to have both ideas, because if you're going to have real progress, it can't just be in material terms, in terms of the abundance of things that we own. We're also looking for moral progress. And here's the deal. I think there are moral facts. I'm what I would call a moral realist. And I don't think it's exclusively a question of having more things to play with. Let me give you what I regard as the two greatest moral achievements of the West. The first is the abolition of slavery, and the second is the emancipation of women. Now, we didn't have that before. And if you had a cyclical view of history and you were to look back on earlier historical epochs, you would say, why would you believe that any such thing as that is possible? That's completely unprecedented. The progressives would say, yeah, it is unprecedented, but it's still possible. So we can have moral, not just material progress. And those two achievements, I think, are justifiably world historical, and they're the two of the things that I'm most proud of in the West. I'm glad that people have enough to eat, and I'm glad that they have various kinds of entertainment. But what I think most highly of is the fact that we stopped and decided that we could do things that were unprecedented, and that you can't find scope for unprecedented moral progress in a cyclical view. All right. Think about the cyclical view of time that you get in Hinduism, and then think about the inevitable cycle of birth and death, birth and rebirth, reincarnation. All right, that's doubling down on the cyclical view. But you don't expect any great moral change, because you are a guy that died 2 weeks ago and another guy who died years before that, and it's just the same thing. In other words, that would go back to Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun. Right? So everybody who advocates progressive politics, you should ask them what they think they're progressing towards and why they think it's possible to achieve that, since it's never been achieved before. And then try and suggest to them that you don't fully understand the rational process by which they figured that out. You'll very quickly expose the fact that they don't know their own tradition. They don't know themselves. And what they really need is to read the Odyssey, because Telemachus is on a mini Odyssey, a journey to self-understanding, which has been thwarted by many of our undergraduates because their teachers have failed them. Instead of things that have shown themselves to be valuable for many centuries, and which have sustained people, billions of people, for very long periods of time, what we get instead is the most important book of the last 15 minutes. And if I sit through lunch, we'll get 3 more equally important books. And that will find its way onto a syllabus, edging out things that are of perhaps more permanent value. All right. Thank you all. I just have so much energy in a given day. Cancer meds are almost as bad as cancer. And so that being said, next week we're doing Aquinas, and we'll talk about a new idea, human equality. The Greeks and Romans have no such idea. Are you sure you want to get rid of the tradition which offers you that? And have you thought seriously about what kind of world you're going to live in then? It makes me really like myths. It makes me want to justify them, because I don't want to live in a society that's too rational to be benevolent. God bless. See you next week.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you so much.